2:07:19 UTC 2 nights ago, the impossible happened again. 3. I/ATLAS vanished from every observatory on Earth in the space of a single heartbeat. Not a gradual dimming. Not interference. One coherent transmission stopped mid-sequence and then nothing. For exactly 12 minutes and 11 seconds, every instrument trained on the object recorded absolute absence. No radio traffic, no photons, no gravitational wobble, where a mass the size of a small city should have been imprinting space. It was as if the universe took a breath and withheld it. Then it reappeared closer. Not by a casual orbital drift, not by a slow arc that physics could explain. It reappeared 283 million kilometers inward, along a precise vector that placed it squarely between the orbit of Jupiter and the inner solar system. The relocation occurred with geometric accuracy that suggested calculation rather than chance. In the interval of absence 3, I/ATLAS had covered more distance than light could have traversed in the same time. There was no acceleration profile. There was no trail. It ceased to occupy one set of coordinates and resumed existing in another. When it returned, the signal had changed. The gentle prime number sequences and star maps that had accompanied its approach were gone. In their place came patterned interrogations sweeping across frequency bands we use for GPS telemetry, civilian communications, weather satellites, and classified channels. The pulses were short, precise, targeted, 2.7 seconds on commercial links, 5.03 seconds on military radars, 8.9 seconds on deep space relay nodes. It was probing with surgical timing, building a layered map of who we were and what we had. Analysts who had spent decades listening for something like this found the new transmissions unnerving. Embedded in the modulation were snippets of our own broadcasts and encrypted handshake routines. Portions of Earth-based telemetry were folded back at us like a mirror held up to our own technology. Someone or something was not only cataloging our capabilities. It was comparing them to a reference that was not human. Within hours, the response mechanisms that take months of classified discussion to activate had been triggered. Communications that normally crawl through back channels moved at the speed of alarm. Military assets were placed on heightened posture. Command centers that rarely teleconference with one another began an urgent exchange of data. The language inside those briefings was brittle with disbelief. Our defensive models rely on cause and effect. They assume an adversary must obey transit time. That assumption evaporated when an object demonstrated selective absence and reappearance without intermediary signatures. What made the event more terrifying than sheer capability was intent. When 3I/ATLAS rematerialized, it adjusted its sweeps in direct response to our maneuvers. A European agency attempted to change the pointing of a surveillance satellite, and the alien transmissions altered their cadence within seconds. A military radar went to high alert, and the object increased interrogations of the systems associated with that radar. This was adaptive behavior in real time. It was not simply passive observation, it was active assessment. The physics community reacted the way it does to paradigm-breaking data. Instruments that measure the curvature of space reported anomalous nulls. Particle detectors that would normally register telltale emissions from high-energy maneuvers reported flat baselines. There were no expected neutrino bursts, no gamma-ray spikes. The act of relocation left no fingerprint consistent with energy expulsion, as we understand it. One theoretical physicist described the phenomenon in a single, blunt sentence. It appears to be editing boundary conditions rather than applying force. If that metaphor holds, then the implications are staggering. Imagine reality as a structured ledger. Imagine that position, mass, and temporal ordering are entries that can be reassigned, rather than properties that must be moved from one line to the next. 3I/ATLAS did not move through space. It altered its entry in the ledger, and we observed the result. That would mean the object possesses a control over the substrate of reality that our equations do not account for. The new position of the object was no accident. Placing itself where it did increased surveillance efficiency exponentially. From its new vantage, it had unobstructed lines of sight toward the inner planets and a gravitational advantage that permitted low-energy transfers to almost any target. Orbital mechanics specialists called the placement elegant and terrifying at once. It sat where a single small impulse could send it toward fragile habitats, orbital infrastructure, or Earth itself. It had parked at the convergent point of opportunity. Even more alarming was what happened next. Within an hour of 3I/ATLAS reappearing, other contacts began to manifest unusual behavior across the solar system. Objects that had been tracked for weeks dormantly shifted orientation. Bodies near Saturn showed coordinated phasing changes. A probe in the Kuiper Belt experienced a transient blind spot in its telemetry, simultaneous with a pulse from the new region. The simultaneity of these events argued for instantaneous coordination. Information was propagating across vast distances without taking the time light would require. They were either communicating by means unknown to us, or they were parts of a single distributed entity acting as one mind. If they are components of one intelligence, then their operational design is optimally sinister. Observation modules position themselves to monitor specific classes of human infrastructure. One monitors launch facilities. Another monitors financial data relays. A third watches civil communications and the flow of social media. Their attention map reads like a prioritized list of vulnerabilities. The precision with which they can select and interrogate a target suggests long-term study, rather than opportunistic discovery. Human reaction was immediate and messy. Markets froze, then plunged. Insurance models could not price risk, when risk could be reassigned by an agent that ignored distance. Logistics planners recalculated supply chain vulnerabilities with a new factor in mind. Emergency services rehearsed contingencies for assaults that could happen with no travel time. Governments convened in closed sessions and then in secret. They took measures that they had kept theoretical until now. Continuity of government plans were enacted. Key personnel were relocated to hardened sites. Elective launches were scrubbed. Investment in redundant systems spiked as nations scrambled to create defensive depth against a threat that does not need a launch window. The social ripples were no less profound. In cities, people attempted to go about their days while the news feed streamed raw data and leaked briefings. Some turned to ritual. Others turned inward. Religious leaders released statements that attempted to frame the event within existing theology and failed to fully answer the fear. Scientists published cautiously worded papers about what this might mean for causality and the ontology of mass. Psychologists warned about a rise in existential despair. For the average person, the certainty of control that modern life depends upon fractured into a mosaic of contingency. Military strategists admitted the ugly truth behind closed doors. Traditional deterrence doctrine is predicated on measurable movement and warnable trajectories. That doctrine does not work when an adversary need not traverse space to appear in position. Missile shields are irrelevant if something can define presence without travel. Strategies shifted from stopping a physical approach to preventing detection in the first place and developing plans for survival and dispersal rather than confrontation. The calculus moved from defense to continuity, and yet the visitors did not strike. They have demonstrated capability and restraint simultaneously. That restraint fuels questions more unsettling than the capability itself. Why reveal the extent of your power than hold back? Is it demonstration? Is it selection? Is it negotiation by intimidation? One intelligence analyst posited that show of force informs but does not commit. Perhaps assessment is ongoing. Perhaps the visitors are collecting us into a file and using that file to decide our fate. The absence of attack is not comfort. It is the pause before a verdict. The transmissions also contained fragments that resembled cultural sampling. Brief audio segments matched TV program signatures. Portions of news feeds and musical motifs appeared interleaved with technical telemetry. They were not random. They were curated. That curation implies interest in our narratives as well as our machines. Whoever or whatever is here is studying what we value as much as what we can build. Coordination among nations was unprecedented. Intelligence agencies shared feeds in real time and set aside long-standing rivalries to compare notes. Space agencies agreed to a temporary moratorium on non-essential missions. Civilian scientists were given unprecedented access to classified data sets to crowdsource analysis. The pragmatism of collaboration was a recognition that no single nation holds the key to answering this. The neighbor at the next desk might have the observation that solves the problem. At the scientific edges, the event has opened sterile and thrilling new corridors of inquiry. If locality is not absolute, then the structure of space-time needs rethinking. If mass can be temporarily unassigned, then energy accounting must expand beyond our current conservation frameworks. Theories of computation and information are being dragged into cosmology because the effect looks computational. Some researchers now seriously discuss writing equations that treat position as a mutable variable akin to data in a network. Economically, the immediate shock gave way to structural shifts. Capital fled from exposed sectors. Investments flowed into decentralization, redundancy, and hardening of critical infrastructure. The idea of a central point of failure took on existential weight. Farmers considered localized production. Engineers redesigned systems assuming adversarial access that could reinstantiate anywhere. The fabric of global interdependence was being rewoven with new knots. Time frames changed. What once seemed like a long campaign now compressed into hours. The visitors operate on a temporal scale that trivializes human response times. Forecasting models that stretched weeks into months must now compress scenarios into immediacies. For planners, this meant moving from projection to preparation. The calculus was not about countering a fleet, but about preserving the capacities of civilization long enough to discover whether negotiation is possible. And then there was the psychological scale. The small daily human dramas continued underneath the global tremor. People made coffee. Parents put children to bed. Lovers argued about trivialities. Yet overlaying those moments was the knowledge that the boundaries of reality itself had been bent and observed by other minds. The ordinary felt brittle by comparison. The question the world now asks is simple and terrifying. How do you negotiate with an intelligence that can choose its presence as easily as flipping a switch? How do you convey that you are not a threat when threat modeling is meaningless to them? What does diplomacy look like when messages can be intercepted at their source and reconstituted as data within a system that sees and analyzes intent instantly? For now, the visitors remain in situ. Their sweep patterns continue. Their data streams pulse like a heartbeat across frequencies we only recently learned to monitor. Governments continue to prepare. Scientists continue to reframe. Economies continue to adapt. People continue to live. The immediate crisis is not an invasion in the cinematic sense. It is an epistemic collapse. Knowledge that once seemed stable no longer is. The rules we use to reason about the world have been altered in a moment, measured in minutes. There is a calendar now that matters to people across the globe. Some count days until decisions we cannot yet see. Some mark the time by the steady rhythm of alien sweeps. Whatever timetable they use remains unknown to us. We can only report what we observe and attempt to make meaning of it. For a species that built civilizations on assumptions of distance and duration, the realization that both can be overridden by an intelligence with the capacity to reassign presence is a jolt that will reverberate for generations. Stay attentive, not because panic helps, but because attention is the only available currency we yet possess. In a cosmos where position can be chosen rather than earned, the next act may arrive without notice. We are awake in a world where certainty has been traded for possibility. The ledger of reality has new entries. The rest of the story depends on what the visitors decide to read.